The world erupted. Not in a distant, muffled way, but with a series of concussive thuds that vibrated through the very floorboards of their small house, each one followed by a blinding flash of aberrant chemical green light that pulsed against Lily's bedroom window, like some malevolent aurora. Then came the screams. Lily's screams. Not words, not coherent sounds, but raw, primal expressions of pure, unadulterated terror, the kind that ripped through a parent's soul and left jagged edges. Ben was in the kitchen attempting to decipher a new gluten-free bread recipe. Lily's delicate system tolerated few deviations when the first explosion hit. He dropped the whisk flour, puffing into a cloud around him, his every nerve ending, screaming danger. Years of training, of analyzing blast patterns, of understanding the brutal physics of explosions kicked in with a terrifying instinctual certainty. This wasn't a transformer blowing. This wasn't a car backfiring. This was close. Too close. Lily. Her name was a prayer, a curse, a desperate plea as he sprinted down the hallway, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. The acrid stench of burnt powder sulfur and something else, something sharp and metallic, assaulted his nostrils even before he reached her door. It was a smell he knew intimately, the perfume of controlled and uncontrolled detonations, a scent that belonged on a range at a demolition site or in the grim aftermath of a bombing, not in his daughter's bedroom. He threw open her door. The room was a chaotic nightmare. Smoke, thick and gray, billowed from the shattered window through which more violent flashes of color, searing red, brilliant blue, were still erupting, accompanied by the sharp, percussive crackle of smaller detonations. Lily, his precious 9-year-old daughter, was a small, huddled figure in the center of her bed, hands clamped over her ears, her body rigid, rocking back and forth in a silent, catatonic paroxysm of fear. Her eyes, usually so observant, so full of a quiet, unique understanding of the world, were wide and vacant, staring at nothing, or perhaps at horrors only she could see. On her normally pale cheek, a smear of soot. Her beloved stuffed sloth, Sid, lay on the floor, a small smoldering patch on its plush fur. Through the haze, through the cacophony, Ben heard a voice from outside, shrill and laced with a venomous satisfaction. Maybe that'll wake up the little quiet freak, teach her to be part of the neighborhood for a change. Ms. Craven, Henrietta Craven, president of the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association. The name the voice registered with a cold, lethal clarity in Ben's mind, even as he lunged for Lily, shielding her small frame with his own body, his eyes scanning the room for active threats, for secondary devices, for the source of the ongoing assault. He saw the blackened, splintered frame of her window, the starburst cracks in the remaining panes of glass. He saw the spent cardboard casings of what looked like commercial-grade fireworks, some still smoking on the carpet dangerously close to Lily's curtains. One, a larger shell, had evidently exploded just inside the room, its charge peppering the opposite wall with small embedded fragments. "It's okay, Lilybug," he murmured, his voice a desperate attempt at calm. He didn't feel his hand stroking her hair, trying to break through the wall of her terror. "Daddy's here. Daddy's got you." He scooped her into his arms, her small body trembling like a trapped bird. He had to get her out. He had to assess the damage, secure the scene. The father in him was screaming a primal roar of protective fury. But the other part of him, the part that was Senior Explosives Analyst, Benjamin Carter of the Oak Haven Police Department's Bomb Disposal and Analysis Unit, was already working, cataloging, analyzing. This wasn't just a cruel prank. This was an assault with an explosive device. This was a potential crime scene. And Henrietta Craven had just graduated from neighborhood nuisance to a perpetrator of a violent felony. Ben and Lily's life in Oak Haven Estates had been a carefully constructed sanctuary. After a messy, protracted divorce from Lily's mother, a woman who had never fully come to terms with Lily's unique needs, Ben had been granted full custody. He'd chosen this quiet, leafy suburb precisely for its perceived tranquility, hoping it would be a calming environment for Lily. Lily had a rare genetic condition that manifested in extreme sensory sensitivities, particularly to sound and light, coupled with severe social anxiety that often rendered her selectively mute in unfamiliar situations or with unfamiliar people. She wasn't broken or deficient, as her mother had sometimes cruelly implied. She simply processed the world differently, her senses dialed up to a level that could be overwhelming. Her quietness wasn't aloofness. It was a coping mechanism, a way of navigating a world that often felt too loud, too bright, too much. Ben's work was demanding, often dangerous, though he kept the specifics deliberately vague when talking to neighbors or school staff. He usually just said he was a forensic specialist for the police department or that he worked with hazardous materials response. He didn't want Lily to be frightened by the realities of his job, nor did he want the undue attention it might bring. His colleagues knew him as a meticulous, cool-headed expert, a man who could calmly defuse a complex improvised explosive device or painstakingly reconstruct the fragments of a post-blast scene to identify a bomber. At home, he was just Dad Lily's devoted protector, her patient advocate, the one person in the world who understood her silent language, her subtle cues, her deep, often unspoken emotions. Their small house, with its blackout curtains in Lily's room, its carefully managed soundscape, and its predictable routines, was their fortress against an often unaccommodating world. Henrietta Craven had been a discordant note in their carefully orchestrated peace from the moment she was elected HOA president 6 months prior. A woman whose ambition and sense of self-importance far outstripped the limited authority of her position. Ms. Craven seemed to view Oakhaven Estates not as a community of diverse individuals, but as her personal fiefdom to be molded and managed according to her exacting and often bizarre standards. She had an almost pathological dislike for anything or anyone she perceived as different or not contributing to her vision of a vibrant, active neighborhood. And Ben and Lily, with their quiet private lives, quickly fell into her crosshairs. It started with passive-aggressive comments delivered with a saccharine smile. "Such a shame your little one doesn't join the other children at the playground, Mr. Carter. Fresh air and socialization are so important, you know. Or we barely see you at the community barbecues. It's vital to be engaged to show community spirit." Ben had tried to explain politely but firmly that Lily had specific needs, that loud, crowded events were overwhelming for her. Miss Craven had listened with an expression of thinly veiled skepticism, as if Lily's disability were merely an excuse for parental laxity or antisocial behavior. The inciting incident, the first overt act of aggression, had occurred during the HOA's mandatory Neighborhood Enhancement Day. Ms. Craven had decreed that all residents were to participate in a communal gardening project, planting garishly colored marigolds along the public sidewalks. Lily, who had a severe pollen allergy and an aversion to strong floral scents, had understandably stayed indoors. Ben had explained this to Ms. Craven, offering to contribute in other ways, perhaps by helping with litter cleanup in a different area or making a donation to the HOA's landscaping fund. Ms. Craven had been openly scornful. "Really, Mr. Carter," she'd said, her voice loud enough for several other residents to hear. "One would think you'd want your daughter to learn the importance of community participation. Hiding her away isn't doing her any favors. We all have to make accommodations." Perhaps a simple dust mask, she'd then issued him a formal written warning for failure to participate in mandatory HOA activities, accompanied by a completely fabricated fine for neglect of communal aesthetic responsibilities. Ben had contested the fine, of course, pointing out the discriminatory nature of her demands and the lack of any actual bylaw mandating participation in such activities. But the incident had marked a turning point. Ms. Craven had clearly identified them as nonconformists, as outliers, and she seemed determined to either force them into her mold or make their lives so uncomfortable they would choose to leave. The rising action of Ms. Craven's campaign of harassment had been a slow, insidious tightening of a suburban thumbscrew. She began to scrutinize their property with an almost obsessive zeal, looking for any pretext to issue violations. The slightly faded paint on their mailbox, which Ben had been planning to repaint anyway, the therapeutic sensory garden he had carefully constructed for Lily in their small backyard, a quiet space with smooth stones, fragrant herbs, and soft wind chimes, was suddenly deemed an unapproved landscape modification. She complained about the blackout curtains in Lily's window, visible from the street, calling them gloomy and out of keeping with the neighborhood's cheerful ambiance, despite Ben explaining their medical necessity for Lily's light sensitivity. The first truly shocking detail, the one that made Ben realize Ms. Craven was capable of more than just petty bureaucratic harassment, was her attempt to directly interfere with Lily's medical care. Lily had a therapy support animal, a small, quiet, lop-eared rabbit named Clover, who provided immense comfort and emotional regulation for her. Clover lived in a secure hutch in their backyard. Ms. Craven, citing a non-existent HOA rule about exotic pets and fabricating claims about odor and hygiene concerns. Clover's hutch was meticulously maintained, demanded the rabbit's immediate removal. She'd even threatened to call animal control, claiming Clover was a nuisance animal. Ben had been forced to produce extensive documentation from Lily's pediatrician and therapist, attesting to Clover's role as a therapy animal and the legality of his presence. Craven had backed down reluctantly, but her eyes had held a cold, vindictive glint. She was clearly frustrated by Ben's calm, well-documented resistance. The second shocking detail, the one that directly preceded the fireworks attack, had been more overtly threatening. The HOA had organized a 4th of July block party, a loud, chaotic affair with a live band, a barbecue competition, and inevitably a large unsanctioned fireworks display planned by Ms. Craven herself. Ben, knowing this would be a sensory nightmare for Lily, had politely declined to attend, explaining they would be having a quiet evening at home. Ms. Craven had confronted him publicly, accusing him of being unpatriotic and setting a terrible example for his daughter. Perhaps if your child were exposed to more normal childhood experiences, she'd sneered she wouldn't be such a recluse. Later that evening, as unsanctioned firecrackers popped and whistled throughout the neighborhood, a series of particularly loud ones had been deliberately thrown onto their driveway close to the house, making Lily jump and cry out in fear. Ben had suspected Ms. Craven or someone acting on her behalf, but he'd had no proof. It was a clear escalation, a direct attempt to intimidate and frighten them. And now this monstrous, unthinkable assault. After getting Lily, still trembling and mostly non-responsive, settled in his own bedroom, as far away from the acrid smoke and shattered window as possible, Ben's professional training took over with grim efficiency. He called 911, reported an active assault involving explosives at a residential dwelling, requested police, fire, and EMS. He then grabbed his own departmental first responder kit from his car, a kit he was authorized to carry containing basic evidence collection tools, hazard markers, and communication gear. He moved through Lily's room with a practiced eye. The smell was a complex cocktail: sulfur, potassium, nitrate, charcoal, the classic black powder components, but also something else, a sharper, more metallic tang that suggested a more potent oxidizer, possibly perchlorates often found in display-grade pyrotechnics. He noted the shattered glass, the inward trajectory of the main blast, the scorch marks on the wall and ceiling. He saw several spent casings, not the small, flimsy cardboard of common consumer fireworks, but thicker, more robust tubes, some with plastic end caps indicative of higher power aerial shells. One looked like it might have been a multi-shot cake, deliberately aimed horizontally rather than vertically. He photographed everything with his phone, his movements quick, precise, his mind a whirl of calculations and hypotheses. This wasn't just some teenagers messing around. This was a deliberate, targeted attack, using devices that were almost certainly illegal for civilian use in a residential area and deployed with a terrifying recklessness. The midpoint twist occurred when the first Oak Haven PD patrol car arrived, followed closely by a fire engine. The young patrol officer, Ramirez, looked overwhelmed by the scene. The smoke, the smell, the obvious damage. Ben, his voice calm and authoritative, began to brief him, pointing out the key pieces of evidence, the likely trajectory, the nature of the devices used. "These aren't just firecrackers," Officer Ben said, holding up a particularly large, unexploded shell he'd carefully isolated from near Lily's bed, one that had apparently failed to ignite its lift charge. "This is a 3-inch aerial display shell, potentially a maroon judging by the casing, illegal for civilian use without a federal license and extensive permits. Firing this into a child's bedroom, that's attempted aggravated assault with a deadly weapon at minimum. Possibly attempted murder depending on the full charge." Officer Ramirez stared at him, then at the shell, then back at Ben. "Sir, how do you—" "It's my job," Officer Ben said quietly. "I'm Senior Explosives Analyst Ben Carter, OCPD Bomb Squad and Forensics. This," he gestured around the ravaged room, "is my daughter's bedroom, and the perpetrator," he pointed towards Ms. Craven's house, visible across the street, where she was now standing on her porch, watching the emergency response with an expression of feigned concern, "is Henrietta Craven, our HOA president." Ramirez's eyes widened. He'd heard of Analyst Carter, of course. Everyone in the department knew of the quiet, intense expert who dealt with the city's most dangerous and complex explosive-related incidents. To realize that this man, this legend in their own department, was the victim, that his own child had been targeted in such a horrific way, it changed everything. The investigation instantly escalated from a serious local incident to a major felony case with an expert witness and victim who was one of their own. Ms. Craven, watching from her porch, could not have known the full import of Ben's identity, but she must have sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden intense focus of the responding officers, the way they deferred to Ben, as he pointed out evidence as he directed the initial scene preservation. Her feigned concern began to morph into a visible unease. The tables had just turned spectacularly and irrevocably. The climax of Henrietta Craven's destructive reign came not in a blaze of glory, but under the cold, unwavering scrutiny of the law, a law that Ben Carter knew better than almost anyone. Over the next few hours, as specialized forensic teams from his own unit arrived to meticulously process the scene in Lily's bedroom, Ben, having recused himself from the official evidence collection to avoid any conflict of interest, but providing expert consultation, worked with Detective Harding, a sharp, experienced investigator assigned to the case. He identified the recovered fireworks, remnants a mix of illegally oversized consumer fireworks, several commercial-grade aerial shells, and most damningly evidence of tampering and modification on some of the devices, suggesting an attempt to enhance their explosive power or direct their trajectory. He explained the ATF regulations, the state laws, the city ordinances, that Ms. Craven had violated, each one carrying significant penalties. He provided Harding with a detailed analysis of the potential for lethal injury or catastrophic fire had all the devices detonated as intended inside a confined space like Lily's room. Armed with Ben's expert analysis, the eyewitness accounts of neighbors who had seen Ms. Craven launching the fireworks and heard her vitriolic comment about Lily, and the damning physical evidence recovered from the scene, Detective Harding secured an arrest warrant. The charges were formidable aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, creating substantial risk of death or serious injury possession, and use of illegal and prohibited explosive devices, and child abuse. The arrest took place just before dawn. Ben, despite his personal involvement, was permitted by his superiors, who were both appalled by the attack on his family and deeply impressed by his composure and professionalism, to accompany Detective Harding and a uniformed team to Ms. Craven's residence, strictly as an observer and expert consultant if needed. Ms. Craven answered the door in a pristine silk robe, her hair perfectly coiffed, even at this early hour, an expression of carefully cultivated surprise on her face. Detective Harding analyst Carter, she said, her voice smooth as honey, though her eyes darted nervously between them. Is there some news about the unfortunate fireworks incident? I do hope poor little Lily is all right. Such a shame when these things happen, due to parental negligence in supervising children around holiday pyrotechnics. She was already trying to spin her narrative to deflect blame. Detective Harding was unmoved. Henrietta Craven, she said, her voice clear and firm. I have a warrant for your arrest for the crimes of aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, illegal use of explosives, and child abuse perpetrated against Lily Carter, age 9, at approximately 9:17 p.m. last night. Ms. Craven's composure finally shattered, her face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and rage. This is outrageous, an absurd lie. You have no proof that man, she pointed a trembling finger at Ben, is using his position to harass me. He's the one who's negligent. His daughter is a strange, silent little creature who doesn't belong in a normal community. I was merely trying to encourage her to come out of her shell. It was a harmless prank. Some sparklers. Ben stepped forward, then his voice quiet, but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority and expertise. Ms. Craven, he said, his eyes like chips of ice. What you launched at my daughter's bedroom window were not sparklers. They were illegally modified 1.3G display fireworks, including several 3-inch aerial shells with multi-break charges and at least one suspected thermite-enhanced fountain, fired horizontally from a proximity of less than 50 feet into an occupied dwelling specifically aimed at a child's bedroom. The explosive potential was equivalent to several sticks of dynamite. Had they all detonated as you clearly intended, they would have blown out the entire side of the house, and Lily would have been killed or catastrophically injured. That Ms. Craven is not a prank. That is attempted murder. His calm, precise, horrifyingly detailed deconstruction of her actions, delivered with the unimpeachable authority of a renowned explosives expert, silenced her. The fight drained out of her. She stared at him, her mouth agape, the full terrifying reality of what she had done and the inescapable consequences finally crashing down upon her. The community busybody, the HOA tyrant, was exposed as a would-be killer, her weapon of choice, not gossip or bylaws, but high explosives. As the officers led a now sobbing, incoherent Henrietta Craven away in handcuffs, several neighbors awakened by the commotion watched from their porches, their faces pale with shock and dawning understanding. The reign of their self-appointed queen of Oakhaven Estates had ended not with a whimper, but with the deafening roar of her own malice, backfiring upon her. The falling action was a long, arduous journey through the legal system and the equally challenging path of Lily's emotional healing. Ms. Craven, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence and Ben's damning expert testimony, was denied bail. Her attempts to paint herself as a victim of a vindictive police conspiracy or as a well-meaning but misunderstood community leader were met with universal scorn. The local media picked up the story. HOA president accused of fireworks attack on disabled child's bedroom, and the public outcry was immense. Ben, with the full support of his department, took a leave of absence to focus on Lily. Her room was uninhabitable, the smell of smoke and chemicals stubbornly clinging to everything, despite professional cleaning. More importantly, it was no longer her safe space. It was a place of terror. She refused to sleep alone, suffered from debilitating nightmares, and her selective mutism became more pronounced. The slightest unexpected noise would send her into a panic. Ben, his heart aching for his daughter, poured all his energy into her recovery. He found a highly recommended trauma therapist specializing in children with sensory disorders. He worked with Lily's school to create a modified learning plan. He spent hours simply holding her, reading to her patiently, waiting for her to find her voice, her smile again. The HOA board, in disarray, quickly moved to permanently expel Ms. Craven. They issued a public apology to Ben and Lily, acknowledging their collective failure to address Ms. Craven's escalating pattern of harassment. They pledged to revise their bylaws, to institute mandatory training on disability awareness and conflict resolution, and to foster a more inclusive and supportive community environment. Several board members, ashamed of their previous inaction, resigned. The community response was a mixture of horror, guilt, and a surprising outpouring of support. Neighbors who had once been intimidated by Ms. Craven or who had perhaps unthinkingly bought into her negative portrayal of Ben and Lily now reached out with offers of help. They organized a fundraiser to assist with the repairs to Ben's house and Lily's medical expenses. They brought meals, offered to help with errands, and most importantly, they began to learn about autism, about sensory sensitivities, about the importance of creating a truly welcoming environment for everyone. Lily, in her quiet, unintentional way, became a catalyst for profound change in Oakhaven Estates. Henrietta Craven's trial was a media sensation. The prosecution, armed with Ben's meticulous forensic analysis and the powerful, emotionally charged victim impact statements Lily's delivered through her therapist, painted a clear picture of a calculated, malicious attack on a vulnerable child. Craven's defense attorney's attempts to portray her as a misunderstood eccentric or to downplay the severity of the explosives used were systematically dismantled by Ben's calm, authoritative testimony on the witness stand. He explained in clear layman's terms the destructive potential of the devices, the illegality of their possession and use, and the terrifying proximity of Lily to a potential catastrophe. The jury's verdict was swift and unanimous: guilty on all major counts, including aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, causing serious emotional injury, use of an explosive device with intent to cause harm, and felony child endangerment. The judge, in sentencing Ms. Craven, spoke scathingly of her appalling lack of empathy, her calculated cruelty, and her extreme abuse of a position of trust. Henrietta Craven was sentenced to 15 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for at least 10. Her assets were seized to cover hefty fines and a substantial civil settlement awarded to Ben and Lily for damages and ongoing therapy costs. Her life, as she knew it, was over. The resolution was not a simple return to normalcy, for normalcy had been irrevocably altered, but it was a journey towards a new, more resilient kind of peace. Lily's healing was a slow, painstaking process, marked by small victories. The day she first ventured back into her rebuilt bedroom, now redecorated in soothing colors, with reinforced safety glass in the windows and a state-of-the-art soundproofing system. The day she spoke her first complete sentence to her therapist. The day she drew a picture, not of monsters or explosions, but of herself and Ben, surrounded by friendly animals in a peaceful garden with a smiling sun overhead. Ben, watching his daughter slowly reclaim her childhood, found his own path to healing. The anger, the rage had largely dissipated, replaced by a profound gratitude for Lily's survival and a renewed sense of purpose in his work. He became an even more passionate advocate for victims, particularly children with disabilities, sharing his story with Lily's carefully considered permission at law enforcement conferences and community outreach programs. Oak Haven Estates transformed. The fear and suspicion that Ms. Craven had sown were replaced by a spirit of cooperation and understanding. The new HOA board, led by younger, more progressive residents, actively worked to create an inclusive environment. They installed sensory-friendly play equipment in the community park. They organized quiet hours at the pool. They celebrated diversity rather than demanding conformity. One cool autumn evening, a year after the attack, Ben and Lily sat on their porch swing watching the leaves fall. Lily, nestled beside him, was quietly humming a little tune, her hand tracing patterns on his arm, her unique way of expressing contentment. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and bright. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice still soft, but no longer tinged with fear. "The stars are pretty tonight." Ben looked up at the vast, indifferent sky, then back at his daughter's precious face. The scars of that terrible night would always remain a reminder of the darkness that could lurk even in the most ordinary of places. But they were no longer the defining feature of their lives. They were surrounded by a community that had learned, grown, and healed alongside them. Henrietta Craven was a fading, bitter memory. What endured was the love between a father and his daughter, the resilience of the human spirit, and the quiet, unyielding triumph of light over the destructive power of hatred. The explosions had ceased, replaced by the gentle, comforting sounds of a neighborhood that had finally found its heart.